I was 71 years old when I discovered that 42 years of marriage could evaporate in a single August morning, and that the man for whom I had put all my dreams on hold was capable of trading me in for a younger woman without so much as blinking. What I didn't know in that moment of despair, as my world crumbled and I felt like the most insignificant creature on the planet, was that this brutal betrayal would be the push I needed to finally become the woman I always should have been. This is the story of how I transformed the worst pain of my life into my greatest victory. And if you've ever felt invisible, discarded, or too small to start over, you need to hear every word of what happened to me, because I promise it will completely change the way you see your own life. Stay with me until the end, because the twist no one saw coming will leave you speechless. My name is Eleanor. I'm 71, and I will never forget that August morning in Knoxville, Tennessee, when my world collapsed. The stifling southern heat had already settled in early, but nothing compared to the weight I felt in my chest when I came downstairs and saw Richard, my 73-year-old husband, hauling 2 large suitcases onto the front porch. 42 years of marriage, 42 years building a life together, and there he was, with that distant look I'd never seen before, as if I were a stranger. My heart hammered when I noticed a car parked on the street, the engine running, and inside it, a young woman staring straight ahead. I rushed to the door, my hands trembling as I held the frame, and asked what was happening, even though a part of me already knew the answer. Richard didn't even look me in the eyes when he spoke, his voice colder than it had ever been with me. He said he was moving out, that he had fallen in love with Skye, a former student from his accounting classes at the Adult Education Center, and that I needed to accept it because he deserved to be happy in the years he still had left. The words cut like sharp blades, each syllable tearing pieces from the woman I thought I was. I tried to speak. My mouth opened, but no sound came out, and all I could do was watch as he placed the suitcases in the trunk, got into the car, and drove away without glancing back a single time. I stood there on the porch for hours, or maybe minutes. I can't say for sure because time had lost all meaning. The old oak tree in the yard swayed in the warm breeze, the same tree we had planted together when we moved into that house almost 4 decades ago, and now it witnessed the end of everything I knew. I stumbled inside, closed the door, and slid down to the floor, hugging my knees as the tears finally came, hot and bitter, wetting my face and my floral print shirt that Richard always claimed he liked. The house was too silent, a deafening silence that screamed his absence, and for the first time in over 40 years, I was completely alone. The first few weeks were a haze of pain and denial. I woke up every morning expecting to hear Richard in the bathroom, the sound of running water as he shaved, the smell of the coffee I always prepared at 6 sharp. But there was only emptiness, a void so deep it seemed to swallow me whole. I stopped eating properly. Food had no taste, and I lost almost 10 pounds in the first month. My daughter, Stella, 38, called every day from Indianapolis, her voice full of worry on the other end of the line, pleading with me to come stay with her, saying it wasn't healthy to be alone in that state. But I couldn't move. It was as if my feet were glued to the floor of that house, which now felt like a mausoleum of dead memories. I had always been a woman of quiet resilience, the kind of person who endures storms without making noise, who solves problems alone and moves forward without complaint. My mother raised me that way, saying, "A strong woman doesn't cry. A strong woman doesn't let things get her down. A strong woman endures whatever comes." But this time was different, because it wasn't just a husband I had lost. It was my entire identity. For 42 years, I was Richard's wife, the woman who maintained his home, who cooked the meals he liked, who washed his clothes, who organized his life. Who was I without him? The question tormented me during sleepless nights. when the silence of the house weighed so heavily I could barely breathe. There was a devastating conflict raging inside me, two voices constantly fighting in my head. One part of me, the weak and dependent part I hated to acknowledge, wanted to call Richard and beg him to return, to say I would change, that I would be better, that I would do anything to have our life back. But there was another voice, new and enraged, a voice I had never heard before, that whispered different things. This voice said I deserved more than being discarded like old furniture, that I had value beyond being someone's shadow, that 42 years of dedication were worth more than a cold farewell on an August morning. It was on one particularly difficult afternoon, when I was sitting in the kitchen staring into space, that Delilah, my neighbor from number 18, appeared at the back door with a cake. Delilah was always known as the neighborhood gossip queen, but at that moment I was so desperate for company that I invited her in. She sat at the table, her eyes shining with that morbid curiosity people have when they see the suffering of others, and began to talk. What she told me chilled my blood. Richard and Skye weren't just dating. They were planning a wedding, a lavish wedding with a big party, at the grand ballroom at the Riverstone, 3 months from now. What's more, Richard was spending money the way he never did with me, buying Skye expensive clothes, taking her to fancy restaurants, paying for spa treatments, all with the money we had saved together for decades. The money that was supposed to go toward renovating our house, ensuring a peaceful future for both of us, for possible health emergencies. Delilah said she saw the two of them at the grocery store choosing imported champagne, laughing and kissing in the beverage aisle like teenagers. The indignation I felt was like a fire spreading through my body. While I was here, wasting away with grief, questioning every step I took in our marriage, trying to understand where I had failed, Richard was celebrating, spending our money, building a new life as if I had never existed. After Delilah left, I promised myself I wouldn't just accept it. I wouldn't be the abandoned wife who withers and disappears. I started going through the papers Richard had left in the den, looking for bank statements, documents, anything that would give me a real idea of the financial situation. What I discovered made me even angrier. Richard had opened a joint account with Skye 2 months before he left me, and had transferred almost 70% of our savings into it. 70% of the money I had also helped accumulate, working as a seamstress for years, saving on every grocery trip, giving up things I wanted to ensure a better future. He had left me with only a few dollars, and the house, which was still in both our names. But given the way things were going, he would probably try to take that too. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the empty bed, staring at the ceiling, and felt something shifting inside me. The sadness was still there, deep and painful, but now there was something more, a determination I didn't know I possessed. Richard thought he could just throw me away and move on happily with his young mistress, spending our money, but he was dead wrong. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to make him understand that he completely underestimated me. The following days were a strange mixture of profound sadness and growing anger that kept me awake late into the night. I started doing something I had never done before, investigating my own financial life as if I were an amateur detective, trying to solve a crime. I discovered I knew almost nothing about our accounts, because Richard had always taken care of everything, saying I didn't need to worry about those things, that my role was to manage the house, and he would handle the rest. How naive I was to believe that was protection when it was actually control. I spent hours on the phone with the bank, trying to get information. But without Richard's signature on anything, it was like hitting a concrete wall. Frustration consumed me, and I began to realize how invisible I had become in my own life. A shadow without my own voice, without autonomy, completely dependent on a man who now treated me like disposable clutter. It was on a September morning, almost a month after Richard left, that everything started to change. I was at Moe's Corner Bakery, that little spot on the main street where the smell of fresh bread hits the sidewalk starting at 5 a.m., trying to force a few sips of coffee down my throat. My plate with a piece of cake was untouched in front of me, and I was staring at it without really seeing, lost in my dark thoughts. That's when a man sat at the next table, a distinguished-looking gentleman, well-groomed gray hair, wearing a light blue dress shirt, even though it was the weekend. He ordered an espresso and a toasted bagel, and for a few minutes we sat there, two strangers sharing the same space in silence. But then he looked at me and commented on the weather, how September in Knoxville always brought that sticky, humid heat. And I replied automatically, without much thought. In the following days, always at the same time he was there, and our conversations became less superficial. He introduced himself as August 68, a retired lawyer, widowed 5 years ago, and came to the bakery every day because the loneliness of the empty house suffocated him. There was something comforting about his presence, perhaps because he also knew the pain of losing someone, even if in a different way than mine. It was on one of those mornings, when the October sun streamed through the bakery windows, illuminating the old wooden tables, that August directly asked if I was okay. I don't know what happened, but something in me broke down. The tears began to fall uncontrollably, and for the first time since Richard left, I told the whole story to someone who wasn't my daughter. I talked about the 42 years of marriage, about that August morning, about Skye and the lavish wedding they were planning, about the money that had been transferred, about how completely lost and powerless I felt. August listened to everything in silence, and when I finished, he simply said that I had rights, that the law protected me, and that he could help me if I wanted. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope ignite in my chest. We started meeting not only at the bakery, but also at the home office August kept, where he stored all his law books and old case files. He patiently explained to me about community property laws, about divorce rights, about how asset division worked. I discovered I was entitled to half of everything built during the marriage, including the house, the savings, and even part of Richard's retirement benefits. This information was like a ray of light in the darkness that enveloped me. For the first time, I felt that perhaps there was a path, not to recover my marriage, because now I was starting to understand that I didn't want back a man capable of discarding me so coldly, but to recover my dignity and my financial independence. August prepared all the necessary documents, and in mid-October filed for judicial separation and asset division. I remember the day I signed the papers. My hands trembled so much, I had to hold my wrist to manage to write my name. It was real now. There was no turning back. 42 years officially and legally coming to an end. Part of me still hurt deeply, as if I were having a limb torn from my own body. But another part, that new and enraged voice, whispered that I was doing the right thing. It didn't take long for Richard to show up. It was on a gray, late October afternoon, the heavy sky promising rain. When I heard the gate squeak and saw my ex-husband walking across the lawn that I had tended for decades. But this wasn't the Richard I knew. This man was transfigured by rage, his face red, the veins throbbing in his neck, his eyes filled with a fury he had never shown me before. He pounded on the door so hard I thought he would break it, and when I opened it, he pushed past, yelling that I was ungrateful, a gold digger, that after everything he did for me over all those years, I should have the decency to let him be happy without causing trouble. The words came out of his mouth like venom, cruel accusations that made me feel small and wrong, as if I were the villain in that story, simply for claiming what was rightfully mine. He said I was being selfish, that he had worked his entire life and deserved to spend the money as he wished, That Sky made him happy in a way I never could, that I had become a plain and boring woman over the years. Every word was a knife, and I stood there, trembling, feeling my quiet resilience begin to crack under the weight of that verbal attack. But then, just as I thought I would completely collapse, I remembered the conversations with August. I remembered that I had rights, that I didn't have to accept that treatment, and for the first time in 42 years, I yelled back. I told Richard that he had no right to come into my house and disrespect me, that I wasn't his property, that the money was ours and not just his, and that if he thought he could just throw me out and keep everything, he was dead wrong. I saw the surprise in his eyes, because it was probably the first time I had stood up for myself this way, and for a second he was silent. But the anger quickly returned, and he said he would make my life a living hell, that he would fight for every cent, that I didn't deserve anything after being a mediocre wife for decades. Then he slammed the door shut on his way out, and I collapsed onto the sofa, crying not only from sadness but from a confused mixture of relief and terror at what was to come. In the following days, August brought me documents he had obtained through his contacts at the courthouse. What I discovered made me cold, and at the same time gave me a clarity I hadn't had before. Sky wasn't just a young woman in love who had been charmed by an older man. She had a history, a pattern of behavior that was impossible to ignore. Over the past 5 years, she had been involved with at least 3 older, financially well-established men, and in every case, the relationships ended with her walking away with significant financial advantages. One of them, a businessman from Indianapolis, had given her an imported car. Another had paid for a trip abroad, and the third had transferred money to her under the pretense of investing in a business that never materialized. Sky was a professional manipulator, and Richard, with his inflated ego and fear of aging, had fallen right into her trap. This information completely changed my perspective on the situation, because I realized that Richard wasn't just a cheater. He was also a victim, although that didn't diminish the pain he caused me or the responsibility for the choices he made. I decided to use that information about Sky strategically, but not in the way anyone would expect. August suggested I reveal everything to Richard at once, show him the documents and proof of her past. But something inside me, perhaps a remnant of that quiet resilience, or a new cunning I was learning to develop, told me there was a better way to handle it. I started planting seeds of doubt, small and subtle, whenever Richard showed up at the house to retrieve documents or sort out bureaucratic separation matters. I casually mentioned how interesting it was that Sky always wanted to be present when we discussed financial issues, or how concerned she seemed with details about future inheritances and properties. I asked innocent questions about the business plans she had proposed, asking for details I knew Richard probably didn't have, and I saw his expression change, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his face. It was a dangerous, slow game, but I was learning that revenge didn't have to be quick or explosive. It could be calculated and precise. Meanwhile, my life began to take a completely different turn. At the suggestion of Mrs. Henderson, a kind 75-year-old woman who lived 3 houses down and had always been friendly to me, I started attending a craft group that met every Wednesday afternoon at St. Jude's Parish Hall. At first, I only went to get out of the house because the walls of that place were starting to suffocate me with memories of a life that no longer existed. But what I found there was much more than a distraction. There were 7 women, all between 58 and 78, and each of them carried her own story of pain, overcoming, and starting anew. There was Josephine, Jo, 62, who had been left by her husband after an accident that left her with physical limitations. There was Carmen, 70, whose husband cheated on her with her own sister, and then tried to leave her penniless in the divorce. There was Nadia, 65, who discovered at 60 that her husband had been maintaining a second family in another city for over 15 years. Hearing those stories made me realize something fundamental. I wasn't alone in that pain. My experience wasn't unique, and if those women had managed to rebuild their lives, maybe I could too. Wednesdays became sacred to me. We sat in a circle in the parish hall with our colorful threads, needles, fabrics, and scissors, and while our hands created embroidered towels, decorative pillows, and crocheted rugs, our mouths shared secrets, fears, angers, and hopes. It was there, surrounded by those women whom society considered invisible, that I began to see myself again, not as Richard's abandoned wife, but as Eleanor, a 71-year-old woman with a lifetime of experiences, skills, and unfulfilled dreams. Carmen told me once, while knitting a blue scarf, that the best revenge against a man who leaves you isn't to ruin him, but to flourish without him, to show that you not only survived, but prospered. Those words kept echoing in my head for days. In early November, as the magnolia trees in Knoxville began to bloom, painting the sidewalks with white and pink, Richard tried to force a desperate move. He showed up with Skye and a realtor named Evan, saying they needed to sell the house quickly because he had found an unmissable investment opportunity, a business Skye had proposed that would bring extraordinary returns. Evan, a short, stocky man, began to evaluate the house, taking notes, snapping pictures, talking about the housing market as if I had already agreed to everything. Skye walked around my living room with an arrogance that made my blood boil, touching the furniture I had chosen, criticizing the decor I had put together with such care over the years, suggesting changes to make the house more attractive to buyers. But this time, I didn't stay silent. I called August immediately, put the phone on speakerphone, and he coldly explained to Richard, Skye, and the realtor that no transaction could be made without my authorization, and that he had already filed a judicial request to block any sale until the asset division was officially concluded. I saw Skye's expression change, the mask of sweetness falling for a second, revealing something hard and calculating underneath, and for the first time, I felt I was reclaiming some control over my own life. They left furious, Richard muttering threats about lawyers and lawsuits, Skye throwing venomous glances my way, and the embarrassed realtor carrying his useless folder of documents. After they left, I sat in my kitchen and cried. But this time, they weren't just tears of sadness. There was something else there, a mixture of fear of the future and pride for having defended myself. It was that same week that Stella finally managed to take a few days off work in Indianapolis and came to visit. When she walked into the house and saw me, her face twisted into an expression of shock and concern. I knew I looked different. I had lost almost 18 pounds since August. My hair was grayer because I had stopped coloring it, and the house, which I always kept spotless, was in a disorder that perfectly reflected the chaos of my life. Stella hugged me tight, and in that embrace I felt all the love and worry of a daughter who feared losing her mother, not to physical death, but to an emotional death, a slow erasure of who I was. We spent the entire afternoon talking, truly talking, in a way we hadn't for years. She told me how she always felt I had minimized myself in the marriage, how she watched the mother she knew gradually disappear over the years, becoming only an extension of her father, without her own voice, without her own desires, without her own life. She said that when she was a teenager, she would get frustrated with me because I never stood my ground, never disagreed with Richard, never chose what I wanted, always prioritizing his needs over mine, and even hers. Hearing that was painful because it was true, a truth I had refused to see for decades. I asked her when I had lost myself like that, and Stella replied that she thought I had always been that way, as long as she could remember, but that perhaps now, with everything that was happening, I had the chance to truly find myself, for the first time. It was Stella who insisted I seek professional help, saying there was no shame in needing therapy, that it was actually a sign of strength to recognize that we need support. She researched and found Dr. Lucia Evans, a psychologist with an office downtown in Knoxville, specializing in therapy for women in midlife and older age going through life transitions. I scheduled the first appointment with a mixture of hope and skepticism, because I always thought therapy was for city people, not for a small-town lady like me. But when I walked into that cozy room, with plants in the windows and comfortable armchairs, and Dr. Evans, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm voice, asked me to tell my story, something inside me opened up. During that first session, I cried more than I had cried in weeks. But it was different. It was a cathartic, liberating cry. Dr. Evans didn't judge, didn't give empty advice. She just listened and asked questions that forced me to look at myself from angles I had never considered. She asked me who I was before I was Richard's wife, and I realized with horror that I didn't know the answer. I got married at 29, and before that, I had been my mother's daughter, helping at home, sewing for outside work to bring in money, without ever truly thinking about what I wanted from life. Dr. Evans made me realize that I had jumped from being my parents' dependent to being my husband's dependent, without ever having the chance or the courage to be the owner of myself. November brought a scorching heat that made the days almost unbearable in Knoxville. But it also brought changes I never imagined possible. The sessions with Dr. Evans became weekly, and in each meeting I peeled away another layer of who I thought I was to discover who I could truly be. It was in one of those sessions, as the ceiling fan spun slowly overhead, making a rhythmic, hypnotic sound, that Dr. Evans asked me about my old dreams, the ones I had buried so deep I no longer remembered they existed. For the first time in decades, I spoke about how I had wanted to be a teacher, how I loved reading and always dreamed of teaching children, how I applied for an education program when I was 25, but gave up when my mother said it was silly, that a woman needed to learn how to keep house and find a good husband. I talked about how I always loved sewing, how it calmed me, how I created beautiful pieces that the neighbors complimented. But Richard would say it was just a hobby, nothing serious, nothing worth truly investing time in. The therapist wrote everything down in her notebook, and then asked me something that caught me completely off guard. Why couldn't I realize those dreams now? I fell silent, searching for excuses, saying I was too old, that I had lost my chance, that it didn't make sense. But she looked at me with those calm eyes and said that, as long as I was alive, there was time, and that often the second half of life is when we truly start living, when we finally have the courage to be who we were always meant to be. Those words planted something in me, a tiny but stubborn seed that began to germinate in the following days. Meanwhile, the situation with Richard and Skye deteriorated in ways I hadn't expected. The seeds of doubt I had planted were beginning to sprout. Richard showed up at the house increasingly tense, with deep circles under his eyes and a constant irritability that spilled over into everything he said. During one of these visits to discuss separation documents, he let slip that Skye was pressuring him to speed everything up, that she wanted the wedding booked soon, that there were plans for an expensive Caribbean honeymoon, and that the supposedly wonderful investment needed to happen urgently, or the opportunity would be lost. I innocently asked how much money would be required for this investment, and when he said the amount, I nearly fell off my chair. It was practically all the remaining savings that were still in his name, plus a considerable loan he would have to take out using his share of the house as collateral. I commented that it seemed risky to put so much money into a business he knew so little about, and I saw his expression waver, a crack in the facade of confidence he tried to maintain. December arrived, bringing the region's typical rains, Those violent storms that flood the streets and leave the air heavy and humid. It was on a rainy Saturday, when I was at the craft group helping Josephine finish a patchwork quilt, that I received a call from August saying he needed to see me urgently. I went to his house as soon as the rain eased, and what he showed me completely changed the course of everything. He had discreetly hired a private investigator, an old colleague from his law days, to gather more information about Skye. The report was devastating, and yet liberating. Skye didn't just have a history of getting involved with older men. She had a specific, repetitive method. First, she gained the target's trust, usually men between 60 and 75, recently divorced or widowed, vulnerable, and craving attention. Then, slowly, she began to control the finances, always with plausible excuses, investment opportunities, urgent needs, shared dreams. And then, when she had extracted as much as possible, she disappeared, leaving the men not only broke, but emotionally destroyed. The most chilling part was that she wasn't working alone. She had a partner, a man named Thad, who posed as a financial consultant and who was the one presenting the false investment opportunities. They were a duo, and Richard was just another victim on their long list. I held those papers with trembling hands, reading every detail, seeing photos of Skye with other men in similar situations, testimonies from previous victims who had lost everything. Part of me felt a bitter satisfaction, because Richard was about to experience firsthand what it was like to be used and discarded. But there was another part, smaller but still present, that felt a pang of something that might have been pity, or maybe just the memory of 42 years next to that man. August asked me what I wanted to do with that information, whether I wanted to confront Richard or let things take their natural course. It was a difficult decision that kept me awake for several nights. In therapy, I discussed the dilemma with Dr. Evans, who helped me understand that any choice I made would say more about who I wanted to be than about who Richard was. I decided to hold on to the information for now, not for his sake, but for mine, because I needed to first understand what I truly wanted from my own life before deciding how to deal with his. It was during this period of reflection that something unexpected happened. Carmen from the craft group commented that she was impressed with my sewing skills, especially with a set of embroidered napkins I brought to show. She said she knew the owner of a decor store downtown, who was always looking for talented artisans to supply exclusive pieces. At first, I laughed at the suggestion, saying it was just a hobby, but Josephine intervened, saying I needed to stop minimizing myself, that my work was beautiful and had commercial value. Nadia agreed, adding that she herself would buy several pieces if I sold them. That conversation kept echoing in my head in the following days. Could I really transform something I always did for pleasure into something productive, a source of income, a purpose? I started paying closer attention to my creations, analyzing every stitch, every color choice, every detail, with a more critical eye. And the more I looked, the more I realized I really had a talent that had been neglected and underestimated my entire life. In late December, a few days before Christmas, something happened that accelerated everything dramatically. Richard showed up at my door completely distraught, without Skye this time, looking like a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He entered without asking permission, pacing back and forth in the living room, running his hands through his thinning hair, muttering things I couldn't quite understand. Finally, he sat down on the sofa and, covering his face with his hands, started talking. Skye had vanished. She had simply disappeared, taking with her over $60,000 that he had transferred to her the previous week as part of the supposedly miraculous investment. Her phone was off. The apartment she claimed was hers was empty with a "for rent" sign. And Thad, the financial consultant, had also evaporated into thin air. Richard had lost practically all the money he had left, and furthermore, he had taken out that loan using his share of the house as collateral, a loan he now had to pay without the means to do so. He was ruined, financially and emotionally destroyed, and he was standing there in front of me, not to ask for forgiveness for the betrayal, but to beg for help to get out of that mess. I looked at Richard sitting on my sofa, that man who had been my husband for over 4 decades, now reduced to a pathetic, broken figure, and I didn't feel what I expected to feel. There was no triumphant satisfaction, no pleasure in seeing him suffer, but there was also no true love or compassion left. There was only a strange emptiness, as if I were looking at a complete stranger who happened to share some memories with me. He continued talking, the words tumbling out, saying that Skye had manipulated everything, that he had been an idiot, that he didn't know how he had been so blind. He said he needed my help, that if I canceled the separation proceedings and we went back to being a legally married couple, he could renegotiate the loan, that together we could overcome this. The audacity of that request left me speechless for a few seconds. He abandoned me in the cruelest way possible, spent our money on another woman, humiliated me in front of the entire neighborhood, and now he wanted me to save his skin. I stood up and said, with a calmness that surprised even myself, that he needed to get out of my house. Richard tried to argue, saying I was cruel, that I had no heart, that after all we were still legally married until the separation was finalized. But this time, his words no longer had power over me. I picked up the phone and called August in front of him, saying Richard was refusing to leave my property. Just the mention of legal involvement made Richard stand up, and before he walked out the door, he turned and said something that haunted me for days, that I had always been a cold, heartless woman, and that now he understood why he was never truly happy with me. Those words should have hurt me, but instead I felt a clean, clear anger. I wasn't the problem. He was, and it took me 71 years to understand that. In the following days, I learned through Delilah that Richard was trying to sell everything he owned. Furniture, car, even some old tools he kept in the garage. His situation was desperate, and part of the neighborhood commented with pity, but another part, especially the older women who knew my story, shook their heads with discreet satisfaction. It was during this chaotic period that something completely unexpected happened. On a stifling January afternoon, when I was in the kitchen preparing iced tea because the heat was unbearable, I heard the doorbell ring. When I opened the door, I could hardly believe my eyes. It was Skye, but a Skye completely different from the confident, arrogant woman who had paraded through my house months earlier. Her eyes were red and puffy, her makeup smeared, her clothes wrinkled, and there was a palpable desperation in her that made my stomach churn. Before I could say anything, she started speaking, the words gushing out desperately. She said she needed to talk to me, that I was the only person who might understand, that she was scared and didn't know what to do anymore. My first instinct was to slam the door in her face, to send the woman who destroyed my marriage far away. But something, perhaps morbid curiosity, or perhaps that human need to understand things to the end, made me step aside and let her in. Skye stumbled in and sat in the same chair Richard had sat in days earlier, and began to tell a story that left me completely perplexed. She said she hadn't run away with the money. Thad was the one who had done it, that Thad was her boyfriend of 3 years, and that he was the one who had planned the entire scheme of getting involved with older men. That at first she thought it was just a way to get gifts and pampering. That she didn't know Thad was planning bigger cons. That when she realized the dimension of what they were doing, she was already too involved. And Thad threatened her, saying that if she tried to leave or report him, he would frame her alone. She said that this time, with Richard, Thad had promised it would be the last one, that they would take the money, and start an honest life elsewhere. But when the time came, Thad simply took all the money and disappeared, leaving Sky with nothing, blocking all contact, vanishing like smoke. She said Richard was threatening to file a police report for grand larceny and fraud, and that if that happened, she would go to jail, because all the bank transfers were in her name. All the evidence pointed to her, while Thad had been careful enough not to leave any traces. Sky was there begging me to convince Richard not to press charges, promising she would disappear completely from our lives, that she would never bother us again. I sat looking at that young, destroyed woman, and the irony of the situation was almost comical. The mistress who stole my husband was now asking for my help against the same man. I asked why she thought I would do anything to help her, and Sky replied that she didn't know, that it was a shot in the dark, but that I was the only person who might understand what it was like to be manipulated by someone, to be used and discarded. That hit me in a strange way, because there was a painful truth in those words. After Sky left, I promised I would think about it, but made no guarantees. I sat for hours on the porch, looking at the orange sky of the Knoxville sunset. I called August and told him everything, and he was silent for a long moment before saying the decision was entirely mine, but that I should think carefully about who I wanted to be at the end of this story. In therapy, Dr. Evans helped me process that absurd twist. She made me realize that I had, for the first time in that entire situation, a true power of choice. I could let Richard proceed with the complaint, see Sky pay for the crimes she committed, even knowing that the real culprit would probably never be caught. Or I could use that situation to negotiate something that truly mattered to me. Something that would give me not revenge, but true freedom. I thought a lot about what Carmen had said in the craft group, about the best revenge being to flourish without him. And I realized that staying trapped in that web of anger, resentment, and punishment wouldn't get me anywhere. I then decided to do something that surprised even myself. I arranged a meeting with Richard at a neutral cafe downtown, far from houses and memories. The following months were such a profound transformation that sometimes I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. It wasn't just the physical appearance, although I had recovered the lost weight and even started taking better care of myself, coloring my hair a soft brown and wearing more colorful clothes I found in the back of the closet. It was something deeper, a change in the way I carried myself, how I spoke, how I took up space in the world. My pieces at the Home Charm Boutique started selling surprisingly well. Sylvia called me almost every week, asking for more embroidered napkins, more tablecloths, more placemat sets. Some customers even started placing custom orders, wanting specific colors, special patterns to match their home decor. Each sale was like a validation, tangible proof that I had valuable skills, that I could be productive and independent. The money coming in wasn't much, but it was mine, earned through my own work, and that made all the difference. I used part of that money to buy a new, more modern, and efficient sewing machine, and saved the rest in an account I opened solely in my name, the first bank account of my life that was completely mine. In the craft group, the women celebrated my success as if it were their own, and in a way it was, because they had been fundamental in getting me there. Carmen suggested I think about expanding, perhaps opening my own space, and although the idea seemed scary, it also planted a seed that began to grow. Josephine taught me new embroidery techniques she had learned from her grandmother, and Nadia connected me with a fabric supplier who offered discounts for bulk purchases. We were becoming not just an emotional support group, but a real network of women helping each other thrive. It was in April, as the leaves of the trees began to fall, painting the sidewalks of Knoxville with shades of brown and yellow, that the idea truly took shape. Sylvia called me at the store and said she was thinking of downsizing her commercial space because she wanted to focus on online sales, and that the property next door, which belonged to the same landlord, was available for rent. It was a small but charming space, with a storefront window facing the street, 2 internal rooms, and a bathroom. She asked if I would be interested in renting it and opening my own studio. My first reaction was pure panic, saying I had no experience with retail, that I didn't know how to run a business, that I was 71 and it was too late to start something like that. But Sylvia laughed gently and said that if I could survive and reinvent myself after everything I had been through, running a small studio would be a piece of cake. I went home with my head spinning, doing mental calculations, thinking about the possibilities and the risks. I called Stella and told her about the opportunity, expecting her to discourage me, to say it was crazy for a woman my age to get involved in such an endeavor. But my daughter surprised me, saying she thought it was a wonderful idea, that she had never seen me so alive and excited as in recent months, and that she would help me with whatever was needed, including financially, if necessary. I talked to August, who had become a true friend throughout that process, and he helped me analyze the practical aspects, the lease agreement, the legal issues of opening a small business, the financial planning. He said something that was etched in my mind, that sometimes the best things in life happen when we finally have the courage to bet on ourselves. In therapy, Dr. Evans worked with me on the fears that arose, that internal voice that said I wasn't capable, that I would fail, that people would laugh at me. She made me realize that that voice was actually an echo of all the times I was minimized, devalued, made to believe that my place was small and insignificant. And that now, for the first time, I had the chance to prove to myself that that voice was wrong. In May, I signed the lease for the space. I used the money from the asset division, that money Richard had been so reluctant to give me, and invested it in renovating the small property. I painted the walls a soft shade of mint green, installed shelves to display the pieces, put a large table in the back where I could work and even teach sewing classes if I wanted. Stella came to spend a weekend with me and helped me decorate, choosing light white curtains, putting plants in the windows, creating a cozy environment that invited people in. The women from the craft group insisted on contributing, each bringing something: a lamp, a vintage mirror, decorative pillows, small touches that transformed that empty space into something special. On opening day in early June, I looked at that little studio and felt an emotion so strong I could barely breathe. Above the door, a simple but elegant sign read, Eleanor's Atelier, Fiber Arts and Design, and seeing my name there, proclaiming my identity and my work to the world, was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. The inauguration was modest, just a few friends, curious neighbors, August with a bouquet of flowers, Stella documenting everything with photos, and Sylvia from the store next door officially welcoming me to the world of commerce. But for me, it was monumental. The first few months were challenging in ways I didn't expect. There were days when no customers came in, and I sat at my work table questioning if I had made a gigantic mistake. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, worried about bills, about rent, about the possibility of failure. But there were also good days, days when a customer walked in and fell in love with a tablecloth I had embroidered, days when someone commissioned a complete set of napkins for a wedding, days when I saw my work being valued and appreciated. And slowly, very slowly, the business began to solidify. I wasn't going to get rich, that was certain, but I was managing to support myself, pay my bills, and even save a little every month. More important than the money, however, was the feeling of purpose, of having a place to go every morning, of having something mine, built with my own hands and decisions. It was in August, exactly 1 year after that devastating morning Richard left, that something surprising happened. I was in the studio organizing some new fabrics I had bought when I saw a familiar figure standing across the street through the window. It was Richard, just standing there observing, and there was something in his posture, in the way he looked at the studio, that was different from anything I had seen before. He didn't come in. He just stood there for a few minutes, and I remained frozen behind the counter, unsure how to feel or what to do. Richard continued standing there across the street for a few more moments, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slumped, looking at my studio window as if trying to decipher an impossible enigma. Then, slowly, he turned and walked down the sidewalk, disappearing into the late afternoon crowd of Knoxville. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened and what it meant. It wasn't anger I felt, nor satisfaction, nor even pity. It was something more complex, a mixture of recognition of everything that had been and acceptance of what now was. That night, sitting on my porch with a cup of chamomile tea I grew in the yard, I reflected on the journey I had traveled that year. 12 months ago, I was a shattered woman, lost, without my own identity, defined only by the absence of the one who used to be by my side. Now, looking at the stars shining in the clear August sky, I was Eleanor, studio owner, recognized artisan, independent woman who had rebuilt her life from the ruins. The studio's success continued to grow organically but steadily in the following months. I started offering sewing and embroidery classes on Saturday mornings, and to my surprise, the interest was huge. Women of all ages showed up, some young, wanting to learn skills their grandmothers hadn't taught them, others older, seeking a hobby or a way to earn extra income, and some, as I had been, looking for a way to rebuild their lives after loss and painful transitions. The studio became more than a commercial space. It turned into a gathering point, a place where women shared stories, supported each other, and discovered strengths they didn't know they had. In September, I received an unexpected invitation. The Knoxville City Council was organizing a regional craft fair to celebrate the city's anniversary, and Sylvia, who was part of the organizing committee, nominated me to have a booth. It was a huge opportunity for publicity, and also terrifying, because it meant exposing my work to hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. I spent weeks preparing, creating special pieces, planning the presentation, mentally rehearsing how I would talk about my work. The women from the craft group helped me, offering suggestions, lending materials to decorate the booth, and promising they would be there on the day to give me moral support. Stella came from Indianapolis, especially for the event, bringing her new boyfriend, a kind man named Robert, who worked as a history teacher. Seeing my daughter happy, radiant, building her own life, filled me with deep joy. She told me she was proud of me, that she never imagined I would have the courage to do everything I did, and that I was an inspiration to her. Those words meant more than any sale or public recognition ever could. The day of the fair dawned clear and sunny, perfect for an outdoor event. I set up my booth in the central square, decorating with embroidered towels, colorful napkins, placemats with intricate patterns, pillows with delicate applique, everything displayed attractively and professionally. Around me, other artisans set up their own booths, with ceramics, paintings, wood carvings, jewelry, a celebration of the region's creativity and talent. The movement was intense from early on. People stopped at my booth, picked up the pieces, admired the handiwork, asked questions about techniques and prices. I sold more that day than in an entire month at the studio, and every sale was accompanied by genuine compliments that warmed my heart. An elderly woman, even older than me, with snow-white hair and trembling hands, picked up a tablecloth I had embroidered with a wildflower pattern and began to cry. She said her grandmother used to do embroidery like that it had been decades since she had seen such beautiful and careful work, and that buying the piece was like rescuing a precious memory. In that moment, I understood that my work wasn't just about sewing or selling products. It was about creating connections, preserving traditions, touching people's hearts in ways I never imagined possible. It was late afternoon as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, that I saw Richard again. He was standing a safe distance away, observing my booth, watching the people who stopped to see my work, watching me interacting with customers with a confidence and joy I had never demonstrated during our marriage. Our eyes met for a second, and this time, instead of looking away, I nodded slightly, a neutral acknowledgement of his presence. He nodded back, and there was an expression on his face that I had never seen before, a mixture of melancholy, regret, and perhaps, just perhaps, a hint of pride in what I had achieved. After a few minutes, he turned and walked away, and I knew, with a deep and quiet certainty, that this would probably be the last time I would ever see him. When the fair ended and I was taking down the booth with the help of Stella and the women from the group, August showed up with a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling cider and plastic flutes. He proposed a toast, not just to the day's success, but to the entire journey, to the transformations, to the victories won with effort and courage. As we toasted there in the square, under the lights that were just coming on, I felt a completeness I had never experienced before. It wasn't the euphoric happiness of grand achievements, but the profound satisfaction of someone who had finally discovered who she really is and what she is capable of doing. That night, alone at home, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter I would never send, but needed to write for myself. A letter to the Eleanor of a year ago, that shattered woman on the porch, watching her life crumble. I wrote that the pain she was feeling was real and valid, but that it wouldn't be eternal, that she was stronger than she imagined, more capable than she had ever been allowed to be, more valuable than anyone had ever recognized, that Richard's betrayal, as devastating as it was, would also be a liberation, a chance to discover a version of herself that had been dormant for decades, that at 71, life wasn't ending. It was just truly beginning. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, along with other memories, not to forget what I had gone through, but to remember the path I had traveled. Whenever I doubted myself, the perfect payback, I finally realized, was never about making Richard suffer or pay for what he did. It was about refusing to be defined by his betrayal, about turning the pain into purpose, about using the broken pieces of the life I knew to build something completely new and infinitely better. It was about proving, especially to myself, that I wasn't just someone's discarded wife, but a complete, capable, creative, and resilient woman. Richard had lost not just a marriage, but the chance to grow old alongside someone who loved him unconditionally for over 4 decades. He had traded security for illusion, loyalty for vanity, and was now living the consequences of those choices. I, on the other hand, had gained something much more precious: my own identity, my independence, my purpose, and the peaceful conscience of someone who chose growth instead of bitterness. As I turned off the lights and got ready for bed that night, I looked around my house, truly mine now, and felt a deep peace. Tomorrow I would wake up early to open the studio, work on the accumulating orders, maybe teach a class to the new students, meet up with the friends from the craft group. It was a simple life, without glamour or grand adventures, but it was mine, built with my own hands, and that made all the difference. The perfect payback wasn't destroying the one who broke me, but rebuilding myself so completely that the destruction lost all its power over me.